Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Glad to be here with you. Before I get into my main theme, I just want to mention that next week on May 17th, a week from today at this moment, as I'm recording this here for you, the House Intelligence, Counterterrorism, Counterintelligence, and Counterproliferation Subcommittee will be holding an open hearing on unidentified aerial phenomena. UFOs. So I think that's interesting. I'll definitely be covering that, commenting on that. I'm going to figure out the best way that I want to deal with that, but I can assure you I will have something to say about that. The very fact that it's part of the Counterterrorism, Counterintelligence, and Counterproliferation Subcommittee, that's interesting. But the fact that they're discussing UAP or UFOs, that's certainly very interesting as well. So I'm curious how that will go. I'm trying to get all the information I can on that, and we'll definitely be covering that subject soon. So stick around for that. Stay tuned. Now, over at my website, richardolanmembers.com, I have been exploring a few different issues relating to alien behavior, alien motives, alien society, and so on. Obviously, look, these are very speculative. How can we know for sure what alien society is like? But I have been trying to speculate about this, and I try to base my ideas or whatever I come up with on a few different observable data points. So, in part, on the observed behaviors of these beings by the people who have had encounters with them, or let's just say who have believably claimed to have had encounters with them. There's a lot of that testimony out there that gives maybe a few hints here and there about what these beings are like. And so that's worth one area to look at. Another thing, which is you don't get as much information out of it necessarily, but I still think is useful, which is the observed characteristics of UFOs themselves, independent of any alien observations. I think you can learn a few things about these beings simply by now observing really almost a century of well-documented UFO observations. In other words, what do these objects seem to be doing? Is there a lot of consistency of their behavior over the years? Is there a lot of variability? Are they predictable? Are they unpredictable? Recognize patterns or not? To me, that's interesting, and I'm going to come back to that. And then thirdly, and admittedly, this can be a bit sketchy in principle, and frankly, this is what I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about. But I've been extrapolating out a few ideas lately, theories, you can call them that, about the effects of advanced technology on the societies of any species, whether they be human or alien. That is, how would the development of advanced tech, we're in the middle of an advanced tech revolution ourselves in our own society, affect the behavior of any species? Are there things that would be shared in common with very, very advanced technology? Well, I want to explore that with you. Now, you might say whatever applies to human society may have no application to an alien society, and maybe that is true, but maybe, and this is what I'm tending to believe, maybe there would indeed be possible, necessary parallels among all intelligent species with advanced technology. Well, anyway, when I'm done with all this, you can tell me if you think I'm on the right track or not. How about that? Now, the main question I'm asking here is whether or not highly advanced societies, especially societies with very advanced technology, whether they naturally lean toward what we might call democracy and freedom, or do they naturally lean toward centralization and totalitarianism? That's really the question. At least that's what I'm really wondering about right now. So obviously, we're speculating and extrapolating here, but I do think it is worth some reflection. So yeah, I did a presentation on my site, Richard Dolan Members, just the other day with the title of Narrative Control Among Humans and Aliens. I'm taking some ideas from that. There's some similarities between what I did there and what I'm doing here. There's a fair amount of adjustments as well. So This is an idea that's in progress for me, so just please keep that in mind. But I think it's important to share it. Now, first of all, I think it's important to start by looking at our own preconceived notions about the very nature of progress in human society. I want to talk quite a bit about this idea of progress. I think it's really important to get a handle on. Now, many of us grew up with a vision of the future influenced by Star Trek. Captain Kirk, Captain Picard, Captain Janeway leading their crews throughout the universe, basically spreading the idea of freedom and decent values throughout the universe. In fact, those shows, most of the, when you watch them, most of the alien cultures out there have developed some version of freedom or democracy on their own. Not always, obviously. Some don't. They're the bad guys like the Klingons early on, or the Borg, and so on. But I mean, basically, when you look at something like Star Trek, it's a story of humans in the future, kind of like space cowboys, free people trying to live in a relatively free, totally multicultural universe in which you've got different societies and different cultures trying to deal with each other, hopefully trying to respect each other, and so on. Now, I mean, obviously, these notions completely reflect contemporary human society, obviously. But the point here that I'm trying to make is that the notion is that, like, as we move further into the future, not only is our technology going to get better, but our freedoms are going to increase, or at least our freedoms will be maintained. I think that's the vision you get from something like a Star Trek version of the future, right? So this idea of progress, of better tech and more freedom, I think a lot of us have to kind of take it for granted, but it's worth remembering that it did not always exist in human society. And in fact, if you really take the long view, this is a very, very recent idea, right? The notion that things can get better and better and will naturally improve, new, not old. This is a new idea. And it really comes along with the development of capitalism during the age of exploration. Let's say the bare beginnings of this, maybe in the 16th and 17th century. So like, starting around the time of like Shakespeare, like 400, a little more than 400 years ago is when it just starts. And then it really took off during the period of the American and French revolutions, a little more than 200 years ago, this idea of this particular idea of progress. And it's not hard to see why people would start believing in this idea that, technology will get better and freedom will be better and better. It's really easy to see this because it was at that time, and only at that time, let's say 250 years ago and more recently, that human beings started to understand scientific principles and to utilize them in a way that transformed the world around them. And wow, was that powerful. Understanding scientific principles was kind of like finding a magic lantern with a genie inside. It was basically, that's what it was. That's what the scientific and industrial revolutions were like. Now, because this was discovered in Europe, really, it allowed some European nations to dominate the rest of the world. That's right. I mean, especially the English, they really did it the best. But once that genie was out of the bottle, so to speak, that idea of scientific rationalism and of freedom as well continued to transform our world. And it's been a continuous process that we have seen going on, really, especially from the 19th century, the 1800s onward. And in fact, it was during that century that you get all kinds of thinkers talking very matter-of-factly about the inevitable nature of human progress, scientific progress and social progress, both of them. And ultimately, I think a lot of them were talking about cultural and psychological progress. It's like, we discovered science, we've figured out how to manipulate this world. Wow, we can create a perfect human society too, not just the physical world around us, but our own society. We can fix it. We can make society better. We can make people better. This was really the idea that took root at that time, and it's never really left us. And that's the fundamental vision of progress, and even to this day, the very phrase progressive really works with that idea. It's a transformation of human society. Back in the 19th century, you had like the earliest versions of this, we had a lot of people known as utopian socialists. A lot of them were totally wackadoo type people who thought we're just going to like really create a perfect society. None of them turned out well. They all turned out complete disasters. And then the most famous utopian socialist, in my view anyway, would be Karl Marx, who developed a very explicit theory of human progress also. But it wasn't just the socialists. It was the liberal capitalists too. They believed that capitalism was very naturally driving human society into better and better outcomes, greater wealth, which it was doing, certainly for some people, not for everyone. There was a lot of inequality, we all know, but there was definitely a creation of a tremendous amount of wealth that did actually spread throughout the world as time went by. And so there was that. And their belief, these liberal capitalist progressive types, you might say, truly believed, I think, that the development of science and capitalism and their version of freedom, that this is going to would create a more peaceful and a more just and equitable human society based on freedom of economic opportunity and freedom of thought. You know, basically, you get the modern versions of left wing and right wing. They existed 200 years ago in the 19th century, pretty much the same formulations. And both of those sides of it had their own vision of this idea of progress. All right. For both of them, the world was no longer this cyclical action, which is what the ancient people had thought for ages and ages. You know, the same thing would keep repeating over and over. No, that was all gone by the 19th century. Now, everyone was like, we're on a path, we're on a road, and that road is going to be toward greater and greater knowledge and power and hopefully wisdom, progress. And the only arguments were, what's the best way to do it, really? But everyone agreed progress was going to happen. So, you know, I look back, I think about that idea, and I think it had to be a wonderful thing to see human society as on some inevitable path toward a kind of perfection. And it's also not hard to see how that idea over time started to replace older ideas of attaining perfection through spirituality or devotion to God or things like that. You know, it's like, we're going to create heaven on earth. We don't have to worry about heaven and an afterlife. We're doing it now. So this was genuinely their idea, or at least the idea of many people at that time. And I still think, yes, to this day. Well, the thing was, during the 20th century, we had a few bumps in the road, to say the least. A couple of world wars and much more, you know, really put a bit of a damper on the idea of progress. But it never went away. Actually, it really did not go away, especially in America, which came out of the two world wars in great shape, frankly. I remember being a little boy in the 1960s, hearing my mother talk about progress over and over again. My mother was not an incredibly educated person by no means. And she was absolutely into this idea of progress. I didn't know what the word meant. I'm 5 years old. I didn't know what my mother was talking about. Didn't matter. All I gathered was that things were supposed to keep getting better and better. And that was her message to me in the middle and late 60s. Like somehow this was a natural thing. And I know I'm not the only one who grew up with this idea. I think it was an expectation. And that's the decade of Star Trek, which I was talking about. Star Trek in the 1960s comes out. And that's just one of countless examples of how this confident expectation of the future was going to play out, how things just had to be in the future. Well, that was then. This is now. A lot of water's flowed under the bridge since those days. We are now well into the internet age. It's been almost 40 years, actually, when you really think about it. It started in the 1980s, really took off during the 90s. Our world has just gone through such a huge transformation. We have seen an explosion of expression, an explosion of ideas, competing ideas on a scale that I think no one ever imagined. I don't think there's a single science fiction writer of the past that foresaw the scale of what we've created. Not even the greatest geniuses like of sci-fi, like Philip K. Dick, Isaac Asimov. None of them truly saw the rise of information sharing on the scale of what we have today. And, certainly not their fault. How could anyone have been expected to foresee this? The explosion of the internet. I mean, there was no precedent for it. You could put the creation of the internet on a scale with the invention of writing in terms of importance. I really think it is becoming that important. In terms of the scale and power of what the internet's done, I mean, my goodness, there's just nothing that has compared with it. Now, when I talked about some of these themes on my website just the other day, I brought up a few other things that I feel are important, and I'll just touch on a little bit here. For instance, the effects of the internet on the age-old need for what I would call narrative control by power elites. That there's a huge effect that the internet has had over that. And just the idea of cultural homogeneity in general, that I think is a natural desire that human beings have had for ages and ages. The internet really disrupted a huge amount of that. It's been a powerful creative force and a powerful destructive force at the same time to human society. I mean, creative in the generation and sharing of ideas and information, absolutely, but destructive in the sense of wearing down and destroying shared cultural identities. And all you have to do is look at the world's cultural history since around 1990. It's quite obvious. The internet's at the center of all of those changes that we're seeing. It's been such a huge factor in our world. And I think we're seeing a global political movement to create a world system that is now reflecting the technological transformation that is the internet. I think that's really what we're seeing. I've been talking for quite a while about the global revolution. A couple of folks, when I started talking about this, said, "No, you're totally wrong. This is not a revolution." I think folks do not understand sometimes. They have a preconceived idea about what a revolution is. We are in a genuine revolution right now, and it's a revolution in large part to bring a new world system online. That's maybe a good phrase to use, to be appropriate in their mind, the revolutionaries' minds, with the internet-based world that we now have. All right. So this is something radically different than anything we've ever had before because, well, frankly, we've never had an internet before. So, and I think what we're seeing now, what's being created, this global system, flies in the face of what we had expected human progress to look like. In other words, it doesn't look like freedom. This is my point here. We've had this idea for centuries now that progress is going to include better technology and more freedom. But what we are now seeing is that this global revolution, it's like, okay, there is better tech, but is there more freedom? No, actually, no, there is not. So now, one other thing that I guess I'll just mention that I did discuss again on my website the other day is the importance of the story in human history and the importance of narratives in human history. This is something I don't really think a lot of people talk about or appreciate. In my opinion, the story is itself an invention. It's one of the most important inventions in human history. It's a narrative. Human beings invented this form of communication called a narrative, called a story. Didn't exist once upon a time. Some person invented it. It's like this thing happened and that thing happened and this thing happened. Well, now you got a story. And this was how we transmitted information for many thousands of years before we even had writing. This story is super, super important in human history, incredibly important. And in fact, I argue that it's something that is at one of the foundations of human identity. You go back 20, 30,000 years to small human collective societies there. And one of the things that had to unify those small groups of people is probably the stories that they shared, the narratives about themselves, about their world, maybe about the gods, or maybe about heroes, or maybe about whatever. Like, they would tell these stories over and over, probably in poetic form. And it's a powerful cultural unifier. It's easy to see. Your culture had your stories. Those people over there had their stories, and those people over there had their own stories. And that's probably how a lot of cultures develop their identity. I mean, not solely through stories and narratives, but one of the important ways, I think. So that's important, because the thing that the internet did is it kind of helped to destroy the longstanding cultural identification, cultural unity that societies have based about their narratives and stories. What is a nation really but a group of people that share particular qualities and narratives and stories? And that's one of the key things that defines it. And when you fracture those, you're not simply fracturing a society. Some people may not care about that, but I'm of the opinion, this is really just following readings of people like Carl Gustav Jung, that there's very likely a deep, deep need. It very likely could be embedded in our DNA, for all I know, that human beings for thousands of years have developed a psychological, probably a need to live in a community in which they have a shared story, shared narrative. And I think this probably because we just had it for thousands of years, and we probably evolved to want that, to need it, to use those things for social cohesion. And we've had 30 plus years of internet now that have in large measure gone and just exploded all of that. So I think if Jung were around today, he would look at this and say, this is probably not going to end well. And I tend to think that that is the case. So, and this is not to say, well, we have to roll back the internet. I mean, how's that even possible? I'm just saying this seems to be a reality that we're dealing with, that we are looking at the destruction of organic communities that existed in human society for ages, millennia. And now we're looking at the creation of a new society, essentially based around the internet, that is not really organic, but more transactional and more legalistic and bureaucratic, in which personal relationships are essentially being siphoned out in favor of legalistic transactional types of relationships. I have a feeling that's not a good thing for human society. Now, I don't want to get too far off, but I think it's important because that's if that's the world that we are creating, it's probably not going to be a healthy world, and it probably will be one that might make people, it's quite possible it might make them more easily controlled by centralized authority, not less. It's just a possible thought here. But anyway, my goal here at this point is just to impress upon you the importance of the story and of the narrative on human history, serving not just the purpose of cultural bonding, but social enforcement, both of those things, And by the way, one of the things that I've been talking about over at my site is, do you ever wonder about whether the need for ideological control applies to alien species as well as to human species? In other words, controlling narratives and stories for their population. Do they do it as well? Do alien beings have culture? Do they have narratives? Do they enforce obedience, at least partially, through hierarchically imposed narratives that enforce a particular version of truth on the rest of an alien population? Is ideological control a cultural norm for advanced species? Don't have an answer to that. It's just worth thinking about. But let me come back to freedom versus totalitarianism here. So from the point of view of freedom and control, I think that what we are seeing today in our world is a definite attempt to roll back a good portion of the freedoms that we gained through the internet. I don't think there's any question about this. We're seeing a definite effort at reinforcing all forms of narrative control by our political and financial elites. I think massive control, frankly, is being exerted over the internet and over the flow of information. And now we've got formal government agencies, even in the United States, the land of freedom, now taking the lead in combating what they call disinformation. And, look, only I think the most dense people out there cannot see how Orwellian all of that is. And as they're doing this, they're trying to change our culture, a definite break with the past. Now, in this case, I'm not really going to focus on the usual hot button issues everyone today gets worked up over. Issues dealing with sexuality or gender and so forth. I'm talking about something that I think is much more important in terms of cultural change. We are seeing the creation of a culture in which privacy and freedom are no longer considered essential. That's actually the big, maybe the most profound cultural change that we are witnessing in our world right now. And it's not happening overnight, but it's obviously happening. And it's being implemented around mostly the Western world, because that's where freedom and privacy had been most ensconced within the culture. And we're, I think, clearly seeing a rollback of it. It's all being done quietly. It's all taking a backseat to the other culture wars, the trans issues, sexuality, gender, and so forth. But I think the destruction of freedom and privacy, this is definitely being pushed on us, and it's a far, far more lasting and profound influence. So taking those away as an essential right, freedom and privacy. So this is going to lead into the question of, are aliens totalitarian? Ask yourself a question. Is this movement toward centralization, toward the destruction of freedom, is this inevitable? Is this an inevitability in the development of continually advanced technological societies? And I'm asking this very seriously. First of all, we know as a historical fact that many thinkers over the last 100 years, they have explicitly been trying to move humanity into this futuristic dystopian nightmare of a world that is totally managed, totally controlled, in which everything is planned, everything is monitored by intelligent people or intelligent robots or intelligent algorithms. It's a vision that's existed for a full century. It's crazy to think about it, but this is not a new idea. It goes all the way through the 20th century. It's a bizarre form of scientific utopianism embedded ultimately in that idea of progress that I was talking about earlier. It's an idea that completely dominates the globalist folks over at like the World Economic Forum, Mr. Klaus Schwab, and all of his people, but not just the WEF. This is everywhere. This is everywhere in the highest reaches of power, and it dominates the culture. Everywhere you've got significant power. This idea of a micromanaged, bureaucratically planned world. All right, and this has been in the works for a full century. So you could say, well, maybe it's not inevitable, and that might be the case. It's just the result of a lot of planning. However, it's also worth asking. I mean, we have a world now of near total interconnectivity, a near total ability to conduct surveillance on anyone. We have a world in which data acquisition and data analysis goes so far beyond any dreams of anyone that they could have imagined in the past. I mean, even in the recent past, we have a world in which more and more people will have the potential to get incredibly powerful and destructive technologies into their hands. Powerful weapons, like that's all real, that's all possible. So it's a fair question to ask. How do you control all of that? Like, is there a way to do that without massive invasion of privacy and the attenuation of freedom? It's a fair question. I've been wondering about this for a long time myself. I'm sure many of you have too. And then on top of that, you've got the economic aspects of our interconnected world, which obviously requires some level of coordination and maybe ultimately legal coercion. So is there an inevitability of control to this world that we are creating? That's the real question. The real question is, can we create a highly advanced, interconnected world with internet and all the other nice things that we like? Can we do that while retaining the recent freedoms that we have won over the last few hundred years? To me, that's probably the most important social and political question of this coming century, of the 21st century that we are in. And if we don't answer that question sufficiently, we may not like how that all turns out. We have to find a way. Can we do it? And I think it is possible. I think it is definitely possible for human society to maintain its core freedoms and its commitment to freedom in the face of this growing technological society that we're creating. It's possible, but I do think it will be necessary that if it's going to happen, that people are going to have to fight as hard as they can to do it. It's not going to be easy, because what I'm suggesting is that we might just be fighting against the current here. That is a real possibility. That, in other words, the general trend of growing technology and bureaucracy and a surveillance society is very likely going to be toward less and less freedom, less and less privacy. And so for us to maintain our freedoms and privacy as the future progresses will be a challenge. Maybe not an impossible one, but it's definitely going to take some work. Now, I'm suspecting that maybe the best way that we can maintain our freedoms is by enforcing legal protections for people in the face of this growing technology and bureaucracy. And that's not going to be easy, but I think it can be done. Whether or not it will be done, that's another matter, but I think it can be done. But now here's the rub. If we were to imagine all the alien species out there that exist, all the advanced ones, the ones that discovered science and advanced technology, the ones that eventually discovered a way to engage in space-time metric engineering, the ones that maybe have attained levels of mind-to-mind interaction that we would call telepathy. Like when we think of all of these, the ones that are possessed of technologies and powers that we might consider magical, when we think about them, we can ask, what is the likelihood that they inhabit a universe along the lines of our Star Trek? What's the likelihood that they believe in freedom of individual conscience? Well, when I look at the likely development of our own society and how I think we're moving, my hunch is that for the most part, the general development might tend toward a collectivist, centralized form of control against freedom and in favor of totalitarianism. Now, I would like to be wrong, but this is what it's looking like to me right now. Now, if that's the case, that would fly in the face of our old idea of progress. Progress that includes better technology and more freedom. And the thing to keep in mind, it's just worth remembering, is that real freedom, like a true freedom of expression, freedom of like having your ideas out there in the marketplace of ideas, that type of thing, that's only existed for a short period of time, as I was kind of indicating. It's a blip. We developed it at a period of time when it was very useful to have it, in which, you develop a new class of entrepreneurs and a middle class that was encouraged to create and invent all kinds of new gadgets and new things that made the world more interesting and a better place. More tech, railroads and the telegraph and automobiles and aircraft and all that stuff. Like that, you could only have that by liberating the minds of millions of people. And you could only do that by inculcating a notion of freedom so that they could actually do it. So that was good for the wealthiest people in the world as well as everyone else, and they benefited from it. But here's the thing, is that a brief moment in our history? Because today, it looks like to me that the need for a large active middle class is passing now that algorithms and soon like generative artificial intelligence will very likely be doing more and more of the intellectual heavy lifting for our world and for our global elites. So I suspect that they've decided they don't really need us anymore, or at least as many of us. So I think this is one reason we're seeing the revolution happen. Bye-bye middle class, bye-bye freedom of expression, goodbye principles of the Enlightenment, and so on. You know, again, this is flying in the face of our idea of progress, of what we thought we believed progress was. We thought progress included greater and greater human autonomy and freedom. But it may turn out that human freedom and autonomy were simply brief stages to bring humanity to the form of a society that we are now creating, basically one that, you know, serves the algorithm. Is that the world we're creating? Serving the algo, because it's the algorithm that provides stability, planning, order. It's a crazy thought, but I think it's very possibly what we are looking at now. So we can hopefully navigate our way through this to preserve the best of what we have won. But as I said, it's going to take effort. Like I think we really have to face this squarely and not kid ourselves that we are looking at a tide that may very well be turning against human freedom for a long period to come. It doesn't mean that it is impossible to fight against it. But I think if we don't recognize the difficulties that we're going to be facing, I don't think we have a chance. I think we do have a chance if we recognize the challenges that lie ahead with the tendencies in our world to destroy the freedoms that we have recently won in our world. And so that's one thing. The other thing is, again, I'm asking, have other species gone through this same process, and have they succeeded in their efforts to preserve their own freedoms, if they had won any freedoms to begin with? Don't know, obviously. I don't know. You don't know. But it's an interesting thing to think about. And then I wonder if they went through their transition to a hyper advanced technology and possibly have hit a plateau, which I think that we are going to hit a plateau as well. And let's say that plateau is several thousand years ago or more. Well, that desire for freedom, did that maintain itself, or did it just atrophy and eventually wither away? Just worth thinking about. Now, okay, so those are some of my own just speculations on where we are going as a society and how this may affect us in the future and how it might apply to aliens, whether they're out there or here. So I just want to shift gears a little bit and get into some descriptions of the aliens themselves that we have from people, and to see, does that fit with what I'm talking about? Like, do aliens seem like they're in a free society or in a totalitarian society? Really is the question. I can't do a comprehensive view of this, or at least I'm not going to tonight, but you can just look at the two most common alien types that people have noticed over the years. You have gray aliens, both short and the taller ones, and also a lot of human-looking types. Maybe they're totally human, or maybe they look similar to humans, but they're different, which is what I suspect. But those are the two most common types that are reported by far. So in both of those cases, I'm going to say right here, you don't get many indications that these are like real free-thinking space cowboys. Like, you don't get any indications that they're like James T. Kirk or Jean-Luc Picard. They don't seem like that. So now, as far as the grays are concerned, they're usually described as nearly identical in appearance. I mean, you got your standard variations in size and so forth, and in build. But, from very short to all types of taller sizes, including over 6 feet tall, some of them. But behaviorally, there are very few, if any, indications of individual volition among them. Like, in other words, doing their own thing. Now, a lot of researchers, myself included, have speculated that these beings are quite possibly genetically engineered and some form of artificial life form to some extent. That is my belief. I think that they are designed to serve a purpose. And if that is so, well, then we are clearly looking at a form of totalitarianism among the Greys. I mean, how could you avoid that conclusion? Created to serve a purpose, not to think for themselves. They can think at very advanced levels, yes, but they are serving a greater purpose, and that is the reason for their existence. So that strikes me essentially as a totalitarian society. Also, just the intense telepathy that they appear to have might indicate that it would be harder for them to have their own privacy as individuals, even if that's an important concept for them. May not be. Now, it's entirely possible that there are variations there, and that there are, even maybe among gray aliens, who knows, that are their own person, that have got their own personality. It doesn't seem to come through very much in any research. So the indications seem to indicate that they are part of a collective. So when you look at the descriptions of human-looking beings that people who have encounters have described, they're different from the Greys. They're certainly friendlier frequently. They're more emotionally tuned in to us. It does seem to be the case. But and they don't seem to come from our society. They seem very different. And there are so many of these stories, actually quite a few that I have collected along with my wife, Tracy. We've been going through quite a few encounters by people alive today. They've got their story of their interactions with these types of beings. It's quite a few. And I would say that there's a very strong element of commonality among what we are getting. So frequently you get encounters with two of these individuals, male and female, often together. Not always, but quite often. There seems to be some kind of protocol or pattern involved in these interactions with these human-looking beings. These human-looking beings are often described as telepathic. I would say more often than not. Sometimes they communicate by talking, but a lot of communication seems to happen mind to mind. But their manner is extremely ordered. This is the thing that strikes me. Nothing seems to happen by accident among them. There's a tremendous amount of foresight and planning involved in their actions. This is the main thing that I want to emphasize here. So I think, indications for even these human groups are that they may have certain privacies and freedoms allotted to them, but it is not clear to me that they have a great amount of freedom. They seem to be working as part of a collective as well. That's what it looks like to me. Now, at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that we might even be able to gain some insights into these beings simply by observing characteristics of UFOs themselves. In other words, I asked, what are these objects? What do they seem to be doing? Is there a great amount of consistency or variability among just objects in the sky or on the ground that people see? Are there recognized patterns that have taken place over long periods of time, or are their activities largely unpredictable? Well, I would say that there's a high level of order and consistency about the behavior of the objects as well over the many years that we've been tracking them. In the first place, there's a very high degree of stealthiness and secrecy regarding the behavior of these UFOs or UAP. Usually, there are exceptions, but a tremendous number of sightings over many years. These objects over and over are exhibiting the same types of behaviors. Hanging out over people's homes in the dead of night at like 300 feet altitude. Like, what are they doing? Over and over again. And even daytime sightings they're very elusive, and they are consistently elusive. There's a very pronounced secrecy about them that has not changed. in all the years that we have noticed them. It's nearly a century. There's a near, and when you talk about people who've had encounters with these beings, just going back to that, there's a near total unwillingness by these beings to communicate their perspectives and worldviews to humans. Not exclusively, not all the time. There are exceptions, and sometimes you get messages. I mean, we do hear this quite a bit. Messages about human beings destroying the planet, and we have to straighten up and fly right. We have to do better to be able to deal with the aliens. We do get that a lot. But even that's a very consistent message over and over again. So to me, this strong consistency speaks of an extreme level of deliberation. And that, to me, speaks most probably to some form of centralized control. They don't seem especially impulsive, You don't get the Captain Kirk moments where he just makes his own decision. At least it doesn't appear to be the case. Now, it could be one of the comments on my website when I put out an earlier version of this. One person responded, I thought, with a really good reply, which was that it really could be that as we move forward into our future, it's not necessarily we're going to be fully totalitarian. There may be periods like when if we're out exploring in space with less centralized control from the home base, you might have a moment of a greater freedom in that culture at that time. And I think that's entirely possible. So there may be a kind of waxing and waning of freedom that we will see. That's possible. The ideology of freedom took place among Europeans, mainly the English, because they were able to leave the confines of Europe, about 500 years ago, and they were able to explore the rest of the world. So that's a possibility. If there are aliens exploring the galaxy, and if they've gone far from their home world, have they also cultivated a love of freedom? Well, don't know. Or have they continued to be under the control of their collective, even at great distances? Again, it seems to me, just from the limited amount of data that we can collect through people who've had these direct experiences, it looks like they are part of a collective. This is what I think. Who can really know? I don't know. I'm not going to pretend that I know. It is possible that there's a kind of waxing and waning of the idea of freedom across the galaxy and the universe. It's possible. But it is also quite possible, again, I want to emphasize this because I'm just about ready to wrap this up here, that as the technological means of control increase, and as the interconnectedness of societies, both economically and in every other way, increases, there might just naturally be an incremental increase as time goes by of centralized control over all aspects of society, to the point where at some level you're going to get to a totalitarianism. Now, frankly, that is not an outcome that I want. I don't think it's an outcome that you want. So my goal at this point, because I don't have any full answer to how to stop this. Is everyone just going to go ditch the internet and go off living with nature? And it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So our challenge is to find a way to live in an advanced technological society, because that's not going to stop, while maintaining as much human freedom in every meaningful way that we can. And that is going to be a difficult fight for us as time goes by. And I guess the last thing that I just want to emphasize here is that, which I kind of started with, and I've been talking about this throughout, is this idea of progress. I think that our long-held idea of progress really needs to be re-examined, seriously re-examined. I don't think it's been helpful in our thoughts about where we're headed as a society. Not at all. I think, there's this ongoing tension that we see between a desire for freedom and a desire for safety and control in our world. And you've got the world planners using the tools of the internet to micromanage essentially every aspect of human society, more and more and more. And that fundamentally goes against the idea of freedom. And so we really need to understand, what is it that we are valuing here? And what will we be valuing a century from now in terms of freedom versus control? And where are any of these alien species in that debate? Do they, it is a collective identity the norm for most intelligent species? Is the era of freedom simply a blip on the map that societies have to go through on the road toward advanced tech? Do alien societies have their own hierarchies and their own control over their narratives and their stories? How much freedom, how much individual freedom exists among members of alien species? Do alien hierarchies use narrative control as a means of controlling their populations as humans currently do? Just a few ideas to toss out there for you. And I think it's a good idea to get into this because, next week I'm going to be talking about what's going on in Congress and the counterterrorism, counterintelligence, counterproliferation subcommittee, which will be talking about UAP on May 17th. Pretty sure they will not be talking about any of these themes that I've been discussing here with you. What are these beings? What is the nature of their society? I'm sure they're going to keep it much more restricted than that. That's an important conversation to have also. But what we are noticing in this era of, we're talking about UAP every now and then, makes it to the mainstream. But the level of conversation about that it's such a low level compared with the incredibly rich reality that the UFO-UAP phenomenon incorporates. It's an unbelievably rich and powerful reality, and we're not discussing practically any of that. So my attitude is I want to continue to bring up some of these other issues. We don't want to lose sight of them. Not only the nature of these alien beings, but the nature of the society that we are rapidly becoming right now, because that also is going to affect any kind of so-called disclosure of UFOs that may happen in the future. Can disclosure happen in a totalitarian society, for example, which is what it very well may be that we are moving toward? It certainly looks like it to me. These are important issues. How much information are we likely to get on this matter from our supposedly responsible government actors and government representatives? I'm not guessing that it's going to be a lot. I think it's going to be very, very limited, if any. Will next week's hearing be nothing other than just window dressing public relations, or will there be something substantive that we're going to be able to sink our teeth into and continue onward in a public discussion? Well, we're going to have to continue that next week. Right now, this is all I got for you. If you like what I do on this channel here, please, you know what to do. Hit the like button, subscribe, get notifications, all that, obviously. Do check out what I do over at richarddolanmembers.com. That is really where I do the bulk of my work. I still do YouTube videos from time to time, but I do a lot more over there. In any case, I'm glad you were here to join me for this, and I definitely look forward to catching you again soon. I want to thank everyone in the chat family and those of you who provided super chats. You know how much it is important to us that you support our work. Tracy and I are, it would be hard to keep going without the kind of support that we do get from all of the members of our site and here as well. So thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to leave you. Wish everyone a great evening. Let us keep our chin up, and let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.